Is it okay? Yes. Um, as you know, actually I've been last 2 days already talking about my term, which is alignment, and I couldn't avoid it also in my lecture. What I'm now going is not to repeat it, but to give you a very short, actually, historical introduction. The point is, and I mentioned it already, that what I'm claiming that it is new is that I want to introduce the concept of alignment, while the concept is historically known only through its negativity, non-alignment. Geopolitically, the term was introduced, and let me put it very precisely. So it was into geopolitics introduced actually 53. But let me say first few words of the non-alignment movement. As you know, the idea, the first articulation was at the Bandung conference, 55th, but the real non-alignment as a movement was founded actually in the midst of the Cold War, and it was the first conference of heads of state or government of non-aligned countries officially. Non-aligned countries held in September 61 in Belgrade, the capital of former Yugoslavia. And it was initiated actually by Tito, Josip Broz Tito, and who was then the president of the country, and attended by Jawaharlal Nehru of India, Sukarno of Indonesia, Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, and Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana. So these are the grounding fathers of the non-alignment of the movement. And soon over 100 countries, mostly from the third world, entered the movement. In Europe, it was always only Yugoslavia, the member. But it was aligned, actually, during the Cold War, Yugoslavia, with the so-called neutral states, which were Austria, Switzerland, Finland, and Sweden. And Ireland. Ireland was not a member of NATO, no. Yeah. Yes, Cyprus. So you see, you remember. So, but this was this division of Europe at that time. All other countries were aligned. Yugoslavia made of its non-alignment together with these other countries of the third world, sort of it's a political statement, it's a political movement, a political claim, while the neutrality was sort of neither nor politics of balance between the two military blocs at that time. But altogether, if the non-aligned movement was in fact the movement of the so-called third world, of at that time still caught into anti-colonial struggles and violent struggles and wars, etc. And it actually played quite a significant role in the geopolitics of the second half of the 20th century. Today, as you know, none of the fathers of the founding fathers of the movement is still alive. Yugoslavia fell apart, but the movement still exists, actually, and which is in the form, it doesn't play any significant role in today's politics. But what actually motivated me to introduce alignment as concept of geopolitics was the fact that last year Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and India is the world's second most populous nation and one of the founding members of the movement. He has openly, so India has openly abandoned non-alignment as the guiding principle of its foreign policy. The change is even more significant if we remember that it was in fact an Indian, Krishna Menon, who in 1953 coined the term non-alignment. And that another Indian, Nehru, he first defined the concept of non-alignment, the principles, 5 principles, and let me quote these 5 principles, which was mutual respect for each other's territorial integrity and sovereignty, mutual non-aggression, mutual non-interference in domestic affairs, equality and mutual benefit, and peaceful coexistence. And I mentioned it already, one can read in this idea, in this definition, and can understand it as implying this classical legacy, Kantian legacy of the vision of so-called eternal peace at the one side. On another side, it actually still corresponds to the actually European political order, the so-called Westphalian order of sovereign nation state, and the legal space that was actually after the Treaty of Westphalia created in relations among these nation states. And it was especially for former Yugoslavia important, especially when it came to the principles of non-interference into each other internal policy, because, as you know, because of the at that time the so-called principle of restricted sovereignty within the, for instance, Warsaw Pact. So the right of the members of the Warsaw Pact to intervene in the internal politics of one of the members, which were the cases 56 in Hungary and 68 in Czechoslovakia. So today, India's Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, has a better idea, something he calls multi-alignment policy. And behind what some commentators, not without irony, call a grand vision, new grand vision, there are no more universal principles in the tradition of Kantian eternal peace, but rather a very pragmatic idea of, I quote, doing business with all. Let's do business with all, and let's call it multi-alignment. And this is, I quote from one commentary. Without abandoning its independent course, India has moved to a contemporary globalized practicality, which is very interesting. You know, this is this pragmatic, practical level of politics, no transcendental vision, no future, no utopian, no transcendental principles, simply practicality, doing business, according to which it will carefully balance closer cooperation with major players of today's global geopolitics. So there are the players, it's a politic, there are major players, and it's about balance. Like United States, Russia, or China. It will do it in a way that advances countries' economic and security interests without being forced to choose one power over another. This is like, I think it is actually very utopian. You know, this is the vision of geopolitics as always, there is a possibility to always have a win-win position. You know. Regardless of what happens in the world, you align always so that you win. You never lose. It is, I think it's actually very naive. It sees also the world without major conflicts. It's really the expression of the certain geopolitical vision that actually corresponds to the neoliberal global world, which obviously ideologically cannot think of, to use one of these terms, catastrophes. Cannot think of major conflicts, clashes, in which alignment is not a question of a free will, but becomes certain necessity or a situation in which you can lose, not only win. So as long as a particular vision of international politics was based in no more than a pure negativity of alignment, this is the beginning, this is non-aligned movement, there was, as I believe, no need to introduce the concept of alignment into geopolitics. But now, after the non-alignment has transformed into multi-alignment, then I think it is time to react and to think to actually understand that alignment has its own historical transformation. It was non-alignment, it's a multi-alignment, but it really implies realignments and de-alignments. So this is why I'm suggesting that alignment should become the concept, and we should think of this concept and its different applications and forms, because it reveals, as I would say, certain dynamic, geopolitical dynamic, which is typical for the end of the post-communist illusion. The alignment is, so to say, post-communist, post-Cold War concept. It is the concept of the Second Cold War. It is the concept of the Colder War. It is the concept that I'm not saying that history is back in town, but a certain dynamic is back, whether it will be conceived of in terms of history or something else. It is for sure certain transformation, and it marks the end of this like quarter century of the so-called post-history, final victory of liberal Western democracy and capitalism as the only game in the world. So this is why I think that there are now sufficient reasons to conceive of alignment as a new concept of the contemporary geopolitics. And the question to be asked now, there are many possibilities to use the concept so as to understand not only what is happening now, what will be happening tomorrow, but to retroactively understand what has happened during this post-communist time, and to think differently of like, I will be now use a concrete example, to think of the so-called process or moment of the liberation from the communist rule as it is, as I said. It was understood mostly in terms of how General Franco, during the Spanish Civil War, conceived of the Spanish Civil War, interpreted Spanish Civil War as a national liberation from a communism as a foreign occupying force. This is the pattern, this is the paradigm how from Slovenia through former Yugoslav nations, Czechoslovakia, Poland especially, etc., how the nations understood their liberation from the communist rule. As you know, problem is always that communism was in this interpretation understood as something foreign, something coming from the outside of political community, of a nation concretely. As you probably remember, Slovenia in self-legitimation of the struggle for liberation from communism implied it, and it was actually very explicitly demonstrated as the process of realignment from the Balkans, from Yugoslavia, but also from non-aligned aligned movement, from all the connections to the third world, from all political connections, and in terms of solidarity, with anti-colonial struggles, from the South actually realigning itself with what is called Europe, the West, and then soon the term was coined of Euro-Atlantic, how do we call it? Euro-Atlantic integrations. So it was understood as a realignment, and especially then, you know, Croatia. It is also Europe against the Balkans, where the term of exclusion is the Balkans. The Balkans as something that is intrinsically non-European, non-civilized. It is simply the concept. We were in a Balkan restaurant yesterday. Something classically, you know, in an Orientalist way, you can still enjoy it, but you are not part of it. It is different, you know. That. So in Eastern Bloc, it was somehow in the former Warsaw Pact, it was more plausible in terms that people understood really communist rule as Russian, Soviet occupation. So it was nice to see in the Museum of Communism in Prague. There were two posters at the entrance. One poster had the picture. This was Russian bear with a Kalashnikov, and another was, you know, Matryoshka, this puppet, Russian puppet with the jaws of a shark. So, which means that communism was translated into a certain very particular national and ethnical identity. So communism was something Russian, and it occupied something, you know, truly Czechian or Slovakian or Polish, etc., etc. The problem was, as mentioned, the moment when the Russians liberated themselves from communism, so that communism as an outer, force from the outside simply disappeared in something beyond the world. It's even possible, you know, to think of today's crisis in Ukraine. in terms, as you know, in the way how the conflict is presented in the media, which means how it is understood. As you know, this was from the very beginning not clear. Is it a Maidan movement or Euromaidan movement? But actually it is Euromaidan movement, and the presentation of the conflict, not only in the Western media, is very simple. It's a pro-European against pro-Russian, which means that it is the problem of realignment of Ukrainian of a nation state. And I already mentioned this. This would, you know, we can even think of ISIS, of this new para-state or a state form, as especially if we really focus also or take in account these cases of, you know, Western, of kids born and grown in the West, who actually leave this West and realign themselves with something other. It's also, which I want to say, that alignment has also existential, personal level. When, you know, belonging, where do I belong? And that it has political also effects. Anyway, and I suggested already, we could even think of alignment as the concept of what Carl Schmitt was called the new nomos on earth, the division of the world into how he called it, Grossräume, big spaces. In fact, already existing normative identity blocks, like the West, you know, it's or containers of values, how we see it. But in fact, it's a normative block. So that this is why I'm suggesting to introduce the concept with the hope that it could help us to understand what is happening, and to help us in reinterpreting also these 25 years of the so-called post-communist transition to democracy, and to think differently of even, you know, of what happened here in former Yugoslavia, reasons why it fell apart, how to understand these processes, conflicts, wars, crisis, huge refugee crisis, etc., etc. So this is my contribution to the glossary. Thank you.